So let me start this workshop. I would like to welcome all of you, both in the room, and I'm very happy that we are quite a number of people coming here. And then I also would like to welcome those who are connected online. And most of all, I would like to welcome Professor James Pennebaker from the University of Texas at Austin, currently at Hradec Králové, if I am not mistaken. But we are very glad that he agreed to come to Prague to give his talk with a very interesting title, I should say. So we are really looking forward to what you will tell us. So please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I should start off by saying I'm very humbled to be here. This is a university of such great distinction, and also being associated with the linguistics department frankly terrifies me. And it terrifies me because I am not a linguist. I know nothing about linguistics. But ironically, I'm here because some of the work I do touches linguistics. And what I want to do today is give you a different perspective, one that I come from. I'm a social psychologist. I am interested in people. I'm interested in how they think, how they talk, how they connect with others. And the only reason I'm interested in language was due to just a fluke that happened about 30 years ago, that I started to realize that by analyzing language, I could understand people's minds and thoughts and feelings better. So if you ask me questions that are of central interest to linguists, you're not going to be helped much by me, but I can provide a perspective, kind of a psychological perspective. I had a really powerful experience 25 years ago. I had moved to a new university, University of Texas, and David Beaver contacted me, a linguist, and he said, you know, it looks like we're studying similar things. And I said, great. And so we met for lunch, and I told him about what I was doing, and then he told me about what he was doing. And I was thinking, I don't understand anything that you're saying. So we met again, and it took me 2 or 3 times to realize that a linguist actually is interested in language. Now, that may sound odd to you, but to me, it was this revelation. I assumed that linguists were interested in the person who was talking. And David assured me that sometimes they are, but really, they are interested in words and language and how it all fits together. My background was, I went to graduate school because I was interested in social dynamics. Early in my career, I discovered that if people had a traumatic experience that they kept secret, they were more likely to get physically sick than people who had a trauma and talked to other people about it, revealing that keeping secrets could in fact be toxic. And I had done a great deal of research on this issue. And then it occurred to me, if keeping a secret is so unhealthy, what if we brought people in the laboratory and had them write about or talk about a traumatic experience? Would their health improve? And so I started to do this work in the 1980s, where we brought people in, we had them write about either a traumatic experience or about a superficial topic. And by a flip of a coin, we would tell them to write either about a trauma or a superficial topic for 4 days, 15 minutes a day. And people who wrote about traumatic experiences showed reductions in physician visits over the next several months. And this method is called expressive writing. And it really started to catch on. There have now been over 2,000 studies done on expressive writing, that putting upsetting experiences into words brings about fundamental changes in people's health, both their physical health and their mental health. It's also associated with better sleep and many other issues related to this. And one thing that it also does is when a person puts upsetting experiences into words, in many ways, it stills the mind. The person's not obsessing about that upsetting experience as much. They are now, it helps them to organize the experience and come to terms with it and to move on. And that's why I think it helps them sleep. So we did those first studies, and I became interested in the fundamental question of how is it that writing about an upsetting experience brings about such profound changes in people's behaviors. And my lab and other labs started to dig into this in many different ways. And at some point it occurred to me, you know, I should read what they write about and see if I can see some hints to the cognitive changes in their writing. Knowing nothing about writing, I enlisted a bunch of graduate students in clinical psychology or counseling psychology to read these essays and to evaluate them on multiple dimensions. And we found that this approach was pretty much disastrous. It was disastrous because people didn't agree on dimensions of how people were writing. People also found it really horrible and painful to read these terrible traumas that people were writing about. And many of the people that were working with me got depressed. This is not a very efficient system. Oh, and it was really slow and unreliable. So here's a method that didn't work. In college, I had taken a course in basic computer science. And so I had knowledge of an early program, Fortran. A small group of you are probably familiar with Fortran, but it was one of the first relatively easy programs to work in. And it occurred to me that it would be possible to develop a computer program that could simply go into any given text and calculate the percentage of words in that text that were, say, positive emotion words or negative emotion words, or maybe causal words, words like because, cause, effect. And fortunately, one of my graduate students, her undergraduate degree had been in computer science, and she and I together wrote the first computer program that analyzed language. And that computer program is called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, LIWC, or LUC. And you'll see that we have a very sophisticated changer here. Huh? Watch this. Okay, so the newest version is this is about the 6th or 7th version of LUC 22, and it's just come out. The computer program is on a certain level a remarkably dumb program. It's dumb because it's just a word counter. Those of you in computational linguistics are going, if you're not familiar with LUC, are going, oh my God, this is not word embedding, it's not topic modeling, although we can do that. The idea is simply, it's a probabilistic model or approach that simply goes in and counts and calculates the percentage of words in any given text that fall along about 100 dimensions of text. I'll focus on just a small number of these dimensions. Now, some of these dimensions required initially a huge amount of help from raters who would simply go through and, let's say we're looking at anger words, and we would have a group of students generate anger words. We look up anger words into the sources and elsewhere, and we would get a very large group of words that were candidates for anger related words, and then we'd have a separate group of people evaluate each word. Is this an anger related word or not? And what this essentially did was allow us to come up with a dictionary of anger words. And we had a dictionary of sadness words, et cetera, and different cognitive words as well. So what all of this is doing is we could go into any given text, calculate the percentage of words that are anger words or cognitive words or other kind of words, and then evaluate and compare them from one text to another. Now, what I started to do early on, as we had developed this in the, now we're in the mid-90s, the same time that the internet was coming on board. And one of the biggest breakthroughs in my career at this time was the invention of America Online, AOL. This was the first time from your home you could actually go into a computer site, and it was structured a little bit. Well, it was structured so that you could go in, and there were chat groups all over the world, and every chat group had either 22 people in a room or 44 people in a room, and you could go into one that was on football or sewing or music or whatever, and it would be a live conversation, and you could download all of these texts. So I started playing with my computer program, analyzing text to see how it worked. And immediately I started to discover language did not work the way I thought. And I discovered a group of words that always came out in an interesting direction. The first thing I looked at was kind of the simplest: men versus women. Do males and females use language differently? I initially just jumped in blindly, figuring, well, men and women talk about different topics, but do they talk differently? And the first thing I found were huge differences. For example, men and women differed in who use the word I, me, and my. As a side note, I realize I'm speaking to Czech speakers, and your pronouns are pronoun drop. You should change that. It makes it a lot easier for people like me if you always have use the pronouns. But I work a lot in Spanish, so I'm familiar with pronoun drop there, but it doesn't matter because you can still identify first person singular. So for your ears, when I start talking about first person singular, I want you to think about that. Don't worry about the pronoun itself. Think about just first person singular. That could be determined however you want. But here's the interesting issue. Who uses, let me just ask you, who uses I words more, I, me, and my, men or women? How many think men use I words more? Just show of hands. How many think, okay. How many think women use I words more? Isn't that interesting? You're linguists, for crying out loud, and you don't all vote the same way. There, by the way, there is looking across language in every culture I've looked at, there are big differences. Women use I words more than men. And it's quite striking. I was shocked by that. When I first saw it, I thought there must be something the matter with the program. No, that was okay. Or this was a fluke in my sample. I did another sample, got the same thing. Must be something. God, isn't that amazing? 2 studies in a row that come out backwards. The reason is women use I words more because I words don't reflect what we think. Across culture, people think men use I words more because the answer that what they usually say is because men are arrogant, self-important, loud mouths compared to women. Well, they are arrogant, narcissistic, but they don't use I words more because I words don't reflect arrogance and self-importance. They reflect self-reflections, looking inward. If you stand in front of a mirror or sit in front of a mirror and write, you will use more I words than if there's not a mirror in front of you. Whenever their attention is focused on you, you automatically start using I words. If you are physically sick, you use I words more. If you're depressed, you use I word more. The reality is language didn't work the way that I thought it did. And I could go into I can do other tests that you'll fail as well. And by the way, you're not the first linguistics department that didn't uniformly agree. Nobody does. We words, who uses we words more? Everybody knows women do, but they don't. Women and men use we words at the same rates because in every language, there are different types of we's. Some languages, for example, many Asian languages actually change the nature of we, but certainly in English, we is just one word for we, you and me, we, you. Sometimes it has a number of different meanings. Similarly, for words such as cognitive words like cause, effect, because, words like this, who uses these cognitive words more? Most people vote that men use them more. In fact, women use them more. partly because men and women are talking about different things. And this ties in, by the way, to prepositions and articles. And again, articles are difficult to talk to a Czech audience about, but other words that denote a noun, that's a table versus the table, there are ways that every culture is able to make that distinction. But the point is that males tend to talk about objects and things. Females tend to talk about other humans and human relationships more. And with that, you need more cognitive, more complex theories of the world if you're talking about humans than if you're talking about objects. Objects are ironically much simpler than our human relationships. And so you have to have much richer theoretical understanding or descriptions. Okay, let's move ahead. So all of this came to my fundamental realization that function words are central to the understanding of much of what I was finding. Virtually every one of these dimensions in English, we found big differences. I'll come back to this list in a minute. So articles and prepositions are related, they're cousins of nouns, and all the rest of them are really tend to be more correlated with pronouns, with verbs. So it's almost this noun-verb difference, but this is kind of another story. But the point is that just analyzing any given text and coming up with these dimensions, we can start to see differences in personality between individuals. So certain personality types, for example, use language different. We can come up with a fingerprint of personality based on the way people use these different words. Now, I want to speed through this and give you kind of an overview of many of the things that not just my lab, but labs around the world have been doing for the last 20 or 30 years, playing with this idea of the power of function words and other words in understanding. I'll talk about this at both the individual level, and I'm going to slide back and forth between individual level and group and cultural levels. The idea here is I can look at how how use of I words reflect various things. It's related to sex, as I've just shown you. It's related to age. It's related to emotional states for individuals, but we can also get groups of individuals. And if that group of individuals is starting to use I words at higher rates, it's telling us something about the group. And I'll show you some really cool studies looking at this as we look at social media, if we're looking at COVID or other cultural shifts, to get a sense of how entire cultures change by looking at the shifts in the culture's language. So what I'm going to do is go through each of these and give you a few examples. So the first is just some basic demographics. I've already mentioned sex. I can go into any big social media, whether it's Twitter or a blog database or Reddit or other groups like this, or novels or whatever, looking at thousands, hundreds of thousands of texts. And if I know if they're male or female, just looking at pronouns, prepositions, articles, et cetera, the function words, we can define, we can classify females at female or male accurately about 75% of the time, where 50% is chance. Yes, using machine learning, you can do much better, but this is not another side note. I have lots of side notes. I was talking with Emil as we were walking over today in terms of the computational linguistics, which is so much of that has grown out of computer science. Computer science is a field that is I spend a lot of time with computer scientists who are doing, I love working with computer scientists. They are great at classifying. Man, machine learning, geez, that is such a magical, wonderful thing. But as a psychologist, is almost worthless, because a psychologist, we're trying to figure out why somebody does something. And I want to get it, and I want to get an understanding, kind of a human understanding of what's going on in that person's mind. And machine learning, it doesn't do a very good job. I'm trying to understand, so my approach is more an understanding approach than seeing how much variance I can account for. The variance account issue is a really important one for many contexts, but I'm trying to understand, why, for example, what using I words mean in a psychological way. Okay, big differences in sex. Turns out there are big differences in age and social class as well. So the older somebody is, the less they use I words, the more they use we words, the more they use articles and prepositions. And there's reasons for all of these that will become clearer as I talk some more. And those go in the same direction as social class. The older you get, the less you use I, or the more education a person has, the less they use I words. The more they use we words, the more they use articles and prepositions, et cetera. They're thinking different. People, as they get older, think differently. People who, as their social status goes up, or their education goes up, think differently. Okay. I'll go over this one fairly quickly. You would think the best way to identify emotional state would be to use sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis in the computer sciences is essentially, you go through and you look for words that imply happiness or sadness or something like that. It's a good message or a good approach. However, you can do almost as well identifying mood by just looking at function words. So I words, for example, I mentioned it was related to depression. One of the first studies I did that put me on this road was I was interested in the difference between suicidal and non-suicidal poets. So I went through, I got a group of poets, it was a small sample, those who committed suicide, and we compared them with a matched group who did not commit suicide, matching for age, sex, and education and culture. And I was expecting that, of course, suicidal poets would talk more about, there'd be more sadness, there'd be more death, there'd be all these other issues. It turns out suicidal, non-suicidal poets both use sadness words at the same rate. I mean, that's part of the job description if you're going to be a poet. You have to be sad. But the biggest difference between the suicidal and non-suicidal poets was suicidal poets use I words at higher rates. And that was such a striking finding for me. And then I ended up working with a clinical psychologist who had a really big sample at the time. And sure enough, people who were depressed use I at much higher rates. And then later studies that have been done where you track people who go through depressive episodes, what you find is that in depressive episodes, they're using I words at high rates. When they're in a non-depressive episodes, their I rates drop. And in fact, I've been called in to look at case studies sometimes. Did this person die of suicide, or were they murdered, or were they, was it natural causes? What we find is typically if there's any kind of written record, as they get closer to suicide, their I rates start going up. So, so depression, I words are a really good marker. Happiness, joy is strongly related to first person plural, we, us, and our, and also to some degree you. Anger is associated with you and he, she, but not we. And so you can start to see that emotions, people are looking at the world differently. And the use of pronouns is telling us where people are looking. Okay, now now we're going to get into some of the more interesting work, but also some more recent. Again, an early issue that I was interested in that people started pressing me for was, can you tell if someone's lying or telling the truth by the way they use language? And so I started off doing what many people do in the deception literature in psychology is we bring people in the laboratory, we induce them to lie or tell the truth, and there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. And what we found across multiple studies is that a certain group of words did in fact predict telling the truth. People telling the truth tend to use I words more than people who are lying. Almost as though when a person is lying, they are psychologically distancing themselves from what they're talking about. And a second group of words that were important were differentiation words or exclusive words. These are words that are a mixture of some conjunctions and prepositions, where the person uses words like except, but, exclude. They're making a distinction between what is in a category versus what's not in a category. So a person who's telling the truth, if they've been accused or they're asking about, what did you do last night? They will say, well, I was going to go to the store, but then I realized, and instead I did this. You're telling this complex story of what they did do and they didn't do. If you're lying, that's incredibly difficult to do, and you tend to over-include. So you don't, if you're lying, you can't say what you didn't do because you didn't do what you now are claiming that you did do. I mean, oh my God, you can see how good is this algorithm? It's okay. We get about 66% accuracy where 50% is chance. And humans who read the text of this get about 52% accuracy, and people who are watching a video and have access to nonverbal cues usually get about 57% accurate. It is not even close to perfect, but it's promising. Now, various people have started looking at this in terms of real world data. There have been many studies, people have been doing this, looking at politicians and so forth. One of the places that's been interesting for me has been looking at what happens if you're looking at a world leader who wants to go to war. I'm not sure if you can think of anybody like that, but let's start off with George Bush when he decided to go to war with Iraq. And years later, I was working on a project, and it occurred to me, Bush was interesting because he talked to the press a lot, usually once or twice a week. And all of this has been saved. And I love press conferences because they are natural language and it's a back and forth with the press. And what I found with him was about 9 months before the United States went to war in Iraq, his language shifted tremendously, but just along one dimension, and that was first person singular pronouns. He had been averaging, I'll show you the data in just a second, about 4%. Then all of a sudden, almost overnight, he dropped to 2% until the US went to war, and then he gradually went back up. Now, a reduction in I words is associated with deception. And it occurs to me, if you're a world leader and you want to go to war with somebody, you want to hide your intentions. And so this is essentially, if you are out to get somebody, you want to pretend they're still your friend or pretend that you're not going to do it. And I was curious, do you think Putin would do something like that? As it happens, Putin also has press conferences, not as many, but the Kremlin actually collects this data, and this is their English translation. So here is George Bush's data, and Bush's data is better because it has many more data sets. But this is when the US went to war in Iraq, and this right here at that point is when the blue lines essentially when he made that decision. And I got this after he was no longer president and getting records from both world leaders and the Bush administration as well, that he made this decision in August. And you can see that's a really impressive drop. Putin, these were press conferences up until the end of December, the 1st of January of 2021. And I was asked about Putin at the end of December, and I analyzed the data because all I had was this. And I told the people who were asking me, I said, I see no data, no evidence that Putin is truly interested in going to war. He seems to be bluffing. And then as the war drum started to get louder, I thought, you know, I had to go back and check him out some more. And didn't have any press conferences. These were all of the ones that took me to February 16th. And I published an article on this, or a blog post on it. And then 2 days afterwards, he in fact starts the war. But it's interesting the fact that you see a similar issue with him in the translation from Russian. Okay, a few things. I want to talk a little bit about social dynamics. As a social psychologist, language is so interesting, and I'm pissed off at my friends, my colleagues in social psychology who hardly ever study language, because language is it's the metric of connection, but we don't study it because it's so damn hard. And you know, talking to anybody, and you know this as well as I do, language is just such a mess to analyze. But with something like a dumb text analysis program, at least you can do a lot of it quickly. maybe not understand it. So I want to go over just a few of the things that are interesting with language. One of my first projects in terms of trying to look at social dynamics, I was interested in social dynamics and liking. So what I did was I got a group of my friends. These were graduate students, a couple of undergraduates, 3 or 4 of my colleagues, and I was in this original data set. It was so only 11 people. And I asked everybody to give me all of their outgoing emails to between 10 and 20 people, and get all of their emails from that 10 or 20 people as well. So both the outgoing to the 10 to 20 people, as well as incoming from that 10 or 20. We ran it through a mixer so that all I got were the scrambled words of the going out and coming in. And I had them write, I said, in the 10 or 20 you get, I want at least one person that you really like, one person you don't like. One person that's at least is higher status than you, and at least one that's lower status, and various other things, to male as well as female and so forth. The one that came out the biggest difference and the most consistent was relative status. And again, the thing that predicts status the best is I words. In an interaction, the person who's using higher I words is the lower status person. And what's interesting is, as you look at each person, all of us, you know, we are in interactions with high status and low status people all the time. And or higher status and lower status than we are. And our language shifts. I looked at the data and I thought, that can't be true of me, you know, because I'm so open and so forth, the usual deception. I look at my emails to my students, and the student will write, "Dear Dr. Pennebaker, I am so-and-so, and I'm interested in doing this, and I was wondering if I can meet you." And I write back, "Dear student, thank you so much for your email. How about we meet next week?" I'm very nice. I'm not putting this person down. And then I look at my email to my dean. "Dear Dean, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Jamie Pennebaker, and I don't know. And dear Jamie, it's so good to hear from you. How about we meet next Tuesday?" Everybody is polite. Nobody's putting anybody down, but we are using the language of power and status. I get emails, by the way, from people a lot, and I can tell they've read my work because I'll read their entire email. They won't use the word I at all. And their email is completely screwy. It's not the way a human talks. So it's very interesting that there's this status as being, we all are sending out signals of relative status. And if we try to mess with it, it sounds as though we're not genuine. Okay, now you can look at this idea of status. And by the way, it's not just I, it's also associated with you and we. We words are used for high status, you words are used for high status, and I are for low status. Okay, we can look at this for US presidents, we can look at it for all sorts of ways. Okay, these are the collected works of US presidents going back to George Washington in the 1790s to, it actually now goes up to Trump. And what you see is beginning about, it was just prior to around World War I, US presidents started to show more and more clout. That is, they started to talk more and more like somebody that's high status. And this language of high status is also using the language of certainty, a little bit of arrogance. By the way, we see the exact same thing for prime ministers in the UK, in Canada, and Australia. In other words, this is just a general issue, and I've not done this in other languages. But what is interesting is we in the United States, we are electing people who are starting to sound more and more certain, more and more absolute, and they have a sense of confidence. I think humans are suckers for people who have a lot of confidence, even though they might not know anything. I think Donald Trump is a really good example of that. But I should tell you, Obama, he was just as arrogant. Even George Bush was arrogant in the way that they spoke with certainty. Humans love people who are certain. And it's ironic because in psychology, we know people who are certain are the people you should trust the least. Okay. Hopefully that's not true of here in the Czech Republic. Okay. The next issue is social dynamics. Can we start to get a sense of people and how two people connect or groups of people connect by the way the two of them are using function words in a live interaction or an email interaction? And we've got some metrics that we can do that. We call it language style matching, or LSM. And we simply calculate the percentage of pronouns the two people are using, percentage of articles, percentage of prepositions, etc. And the more similar they are in their use of these dimensions, the more their language is matching. And the psychometrics of it, by the way, are beautiful. We've done lots of studies, and other labs now have been doing studies on this as well. My favorite one is a study with speed dating. So with speed dating, you might, if it's a heterosexual speed dating, you'll get 10 men, 10 women, and they will all be in a setting where each female talks with each male for, say, 5 minutes, and then they'll rate, would they like to go on a date with that person? And everybody meets with everybody else. In this project, all the recordings were, they were recorded and transcribed. And what we found was that by using style matching, language style matching, we could predict who would go on a subsequent date at rates better than the people themselves, which on the surface sounds impossible, but it's not, because very often one person thought it went great and the other person says, no, I don't want to go on a date. But what we find was if they're style matching, they're more likely to go on a subsequent date. Using this same metric in another study with couples, young couples, we use style matching in their text messages, their SMS with each other, and for a 10-day period. And again, we could predict which relationships would fall apart at far, far higher rates than the couples themselves. So what I love about this is this really interesting signal. Now, why does this signal predict well? Because we know with style matching occurs when the two people are paying close attention to the other. And in fact, there have been some really clever studies where you have two people and you tell one of the two people, okay, I want you to start lying to the other person. I assume that when we do that, style matching would drop. It went up. And the reason is one of the two people would start lying and the other person's now starting to pay really close attention, trying to figure out. And we know from nonverbal research, if two people are getting along, they are mimicking their body movement, tone of voice, and we're also finding the words that they're using. Okay. there's another way of looking at language as well in terms of social connections, and that is the language of affiliation or attachment. Can I get a sense of how well you are connected to a group? Do cults, for example, do they talk more similarly than people who are not in cults? And can I predict if someone is going to join a cult? Well, I don't have cults in this project. I'm going to show you very briefly. This is more a discussion of Reddit. I'm about to move to Reddit talks. Does everybody here know Reddit? Does anybody not know Reddit? Okay, good. Okay. Reddit is the most glorious social media platform on earth for people like me. It's essentially much like the old AOL mentality, but imagine online that there are 200,000 bulletin boards that you could go to and talk. And they're topic based. So there's one for relationship breakups. I'll talk about that one in a minute. There are political ones. For example, there is one for Donald Trump. I'll be talking about now Bernie Sanders and other political aspirants. There for football, for polo, for sewing, for cooking, anything that you can imagine. There are these bulletin boards, and it's open source, so you can download it. And hundreds of millions of people use these every day. And and from a research perspective, it's so cool because people their name is never associated with their ID. In fact, when you sign up, you sign up with an email address, and that is never linked to your name. The company has it, but that's it. But you have this handle, and you can use this handle in all of these Reddits. And then what you can do is you can talk over here in the photograph one, and then you go over here and you might talk about being in the Army, and this one you might talk about sewing. And what's interesting about this is we're able to download everything that everything you've ever said. Now, we can't pick up if you go and just hang around a group or lurk in the group. All we pick up are the words that are spoken in the group. Now, what this means is the project I'm about to show you is one that we were looking at the Donald Trump Reddit, the Hillary Clinton and the Bernie Sanders Reddits. And these were all for the 2016 election in the United States. And what was interesting about this is people, some people would go and they would contribute hundreds of times in the months before the election. And others might only go once. As with most social media, most people just post once. The second number of times that people post is twice, and so forth. And you can see this curve. And out here, people are posting hundreds of times. If you post 12 times, the odds of your posting 100 times are decent, maybe 50%. If you just post once, the odds of your posting 100 times is less than 1 in 1,000. So you can start to see this sense of people and how they join and how they talk. Can we get a sense of who is going to stay in this group by the way they post on the first day? And also, how can we start to get some interesting signals? Now, the first thing I want to just point out, these are the left side of this refers to the people in terms of how they talk when they first join in the first up to 40 days. And this would go for the first 40 days, the first 20 to 39 days, the first 10 to 9. And these are how they before leaving. And what we did with this is we came up with this fairly simple algorithm looking at 2 dimensions. One is essentially affiliation words. And the predominant affiliation word is the word we, us, and our. And the second dimension that I become really interested in is one that we call cognitive process words. Now, these are not traditional function words, but they're a group of words that include words that suggest insight, understand, realize, know, meaning, modals like would, should, and could, causal words, because, cause, effect, reason, rationale. All of these are words that people use when they're trying to understand something. What we find is we're calling this a fusion score. When people are fused to a group, when they behave as though they are connected, they use high affiliation words and low cognitive process words. In other words, if you're in a group, you do not question. You're not wondering why, you know why. And what you find is, at the very beginning, already affiliation and fewer cognitive process words, and it goes the first X number of days, or at day 10, and the people who are not going to stay there are much lower. In other words, that very first post, these people are talking like old timers. Now, can we pick up when somebody's going to quit? What you see is, so these people on average probably were there for over 100 days, but we're looking at anybody more than 50 days, and we look at their last 40 days, and you can see their fusion language is starting to drop as it gets closer to when they do quit. And we see the same thing for each of these. In other words, there's a fingerprint of who's going to join and stay, but also that there's a sign that they're going to be pulling out. Okay. Very briefly, I'm focused on two types of thinking styles. I've just mentioned the cognitive processing, the working through, but the other one I want to mention briefly because this one is so sexy. This is called analytic thinking. I stumbled across this several years ago when I was looking at how students performed at the university. At my university, students have to fill out an application, and the University of Texas is a selective institution, and they have to write 2 essays about coming to college. You know, why they want to come to college, what they want to do with their life, but you know, the usual kind of stuff. And the reality is, hardly anybody ever looks at it, but you know, it's a tradition. So. Mine is a big university, so we had 4 years of data. So we had this reflected 25,000 students who were admitted to the university. And I was curious if there are certain features of language that would predict their staying. And I tried something I'd never done before, and that was to do a factor analysis, or sometimes referred to as principal component analysis for new computer science people, SVD, singular value decomposition. It's essentially a correlational method that clumps variables together. But I did it just with the 8 variables, the 8 function words. And what I discovered, which just shocked me, was that articles and prepositions are positively correlated with each other. They're correlated 0.2 or 0.3 with each other. The other ones, the pronouns, auxiliary verbs, the negations, adverbs, etc., all of those are positively correlated with each other at a 0.2, 0.3 level. And all of these are negatively correlated with these. In other words, the more you use articles and prepositions, the less you use pronouns, auxiliary verbs, etc. What that means is we can flip these upside down and add the 2 together, and we end up with a dimension that is psychometrically beautiful. And at this end, people are using high rates of articles and prepositions. At this end, they're using high rates of pronouns and auxiliary verbs. And if you pull out any essay that's high on this dimension, on this end, it is a logical, formal, hierarchical paper. My goal is to attend the university because your Department of Linguistics is such an outstanding blah, 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 blah. The second reason, and it's, it's a good, formal, kind of often boring essay. At the other end, you pull it out here, it's a narrative. I'll never forget when I moved from Dallas to Houston. It would change my life. And it made me realize I wanted to understand linguistics. So I've never done, okay. We can now have this dimension. So a high number is analytic, a low number is narrative. And what we find with this is that this dimension, this analytic thinking measure, correlates about 0.2 with people's performance at the university over 4 years in terms of their grades. And this is true if we look at just physics majors, fine arts majors, or nursing majors. Or if we just look at rich kids, poor kids. It makes no difference. Any group, any way you slice it, the higher you are on analytic, the better you do at university. And universities, all our testing is essentially analytic thinking. We never test people, tell a story about the history of linguistics. No, it's compare and contrast. Be logical, be formal, as opposed to be human. Now, yeah, okay. But what's cool about this, the fact is, this predicts really important things. It's also internally consistent. It's also reliable. A person, if we analyze language in one class with another, their analytic thinking is very similar. And it's a good personality marker. We've done some really cool research looking at a lost play by Shakespeare, comparing Shakespeare and the play is a lousy play called Double Falsehood. And there have been people who spend their careers on this for the last 200 years. And in our analyses, this double falsehood has all the fingerprints, exact level of analytic thinking as the rest of Shakespeare, unrelated to the other suspects. But the point is, analytic thinking is cool because it's not related to any questionnaire item. In other words, here's a personality measure that's not related to personality as we know it, but it is related to the way people are thinking. And this is, I find this really intriguing. Now, I'm going to speed through the most recent work, because so far I've been focusing just primarily on how we can think about language at the individual level. You can now start to see how I'm going to move. I'd like to show you, so this is the breakup data from the breakup Reddit on Reddit. So one of the dimensions are breakups. So it turns out tens of thousands of people go to the Reddit, the subreddit that's called breakups, and they will tell about a breakup they've had. It's usually something that happened in the previous 2 weeks. We went through, we had various exclusion criteria, but this is 6,000 people who had a breakup and they posted about it. And we lined up all 6,000 of them so that this is 0 day when they reported the breakup. And then we looked at it in terms of everything they had posted on Reddit versus everything they posted on Reddit except anything having to do with relationships. So we threw that out. So the line throws out everything related to breakups, and the red line includes breakup information. Now, here's what's so cool about this. The average person posted 142 times in subreddits outside of breakup, and 4 times in something in one related to breakups. And what you see, and what I love about this is, you can see that starting about almost 6 months, almost 3 months before the breakup, you see a signal that something is terribly wrong. They are becoming, I like to refer to this, they're becoming increasingly stupid as the relationship breaks up. And here's the great thing, 75%, roughly 75% of the people say that they were dumped by the other person. It came out of nowhere. It didn't come out of nowhere. Things were not going well in that relationship as it got closer. And as you can see, they are messed up for the 6 months afterwards as well. Over here are the cognitive process dimensions. These are the ones where people are trying to figure things out. And you can see as starting roughly about 3 months, a little bit more than that, 3 to 4 months beforehand, cognitive processing is starting to increase, and it peaks when the breakup occurs. And then it takes about 4 or 5 months to get back down to normal. But here's what's interesting. If you look about 8 to 12 months, their mind is more stilled now that they're out of that relationship. Or perhaps because they're in a new relationship, who knows? But what I love about this is you're seeing this at this high level. Okay. Again, I hate to dump so much information, but this is just so cool. I got some data this morning that I've been waiting for a while. This is a project of Kumar looking at how COVID affected the United States. Again, what we did is we looked at city level Redis. So I'm from Austin, Texas. Austin has a population of about 1.2 million people. So there's a subreddit for Austin. We've got one for New York City. We've got Los Angeles. We have about 20 cities. And we're able to go and look at every subreddit. And what I will be showing you will be based on 14 million posts from 860,000 people over previous, I'm just going to focus on about from 2019 till the 1st of April, so this month. Okay, this one was from our earlier one. This just gives you a sense of just references to COVID. When somebody says the word COVID, the percentage of posts as this went on. The one I had, this graph here, only goes until 2 months out. And this was based on an article that was just published based on the analysis of the first 3 months of COVID, just to give you an idea of how it works. Okay, these are the data that just came in this morning. There are 2 issues I want you to pay attention to. The first is the line here, the first line, and that is the beginning of COVID. And the second line is when Black Lives Matter really started in earnest with the murder of George Floyd, which was a big, that was a huge deal around the world and definitely in the United States. There are 2 things that I want to point out. Things we actually have Reddit data for these cities going back to 2011, 10 years ago. And over the 10 years, it was like this, just bouncing up and down and up and down. And you can see anxiety words double from what they had been. Anxiety was huge. And then they started to drop, and then they went up a little bit with Floyd's death. But here's what's fascinating. In the 2 years since the beginning of COVID, anxiety levels are still elevated. And this is what I've been really fascinated with, is what are the long-term effects of COVID? This is anger words. This is in the prior to COVID. And one thing I found in the first 3 months was that anger words were really low, and which many people were really surprised by. I wasn't, because I've seen this in other disasters. But as soon as George Floyd was murdered, it's almost as though this sense of rage. And I think part of it was COVID was so interesting because all of us were locked inside and we had nothing to watch except see this horrible, gruesome murder on television. And you see across the United States, a huge burst of anger. But then look at this, anger levels are still elevated 2 years later. Is that George Floyd or is it just general anger? I can't answer. Okay, analytic thinking, I love this one. Stupid. And there's a couple of things that are interesting here. At the beginning, there's this huge drop. These are, by the way, these are unbelievably large jumps. Going back to 2011, it's been pretty flat. And then you see that it's been slowly jumping up here. But it's fine. Cogproc, but it's overall still quite high. Okay, these are social processes. I'll just say this very briefly. These are affiliation words. I've been quite surprised by this, that the degree to which people feel a sense of we-ness with others is actually higher, much higher than it was prior to COVID. Particularly references to family And this bottom left one is, we had found this early on and it's maintaining itself. People are making references to friends on Reddit at much lower rates than they were prior to COVID. And I just put this one in because it's so cool. I don't know about here, but I certainly am picking up in my town. People are driving aggressively. There's a snottiness out there. I've talked to people who work in service industry. They talk about how nasty people are. And these are politeness words, please, thank you, things like that. Here's what it was like the beginning of COVID. Oh yes, please, and so forth. We're all sweet and nice. George Floyd's murder, it drops a little bit. And then for the last year, politeness levels have been dropping drastically. Okay, this is a really cool study on the arc of narrative. We're not going to talk about it. Okay. What I've tried to do, and I've spent way more time than I wanted to, but you know, I figure what, you're stuck, you have to listen. As I look back at all of this, I'm really excited by this fundamental question of what do words tell about us? What do they say about the culture? What do they say about how can we use words as ways of understanding how the world is shifting and how we are shifting? And, you know, on this other issue of what do words really mean? And I view this as just at the beginning of this. I feel good about the word I. I have a much better sense of that. And it's an important word. It's the most common word used in spoken language. I have a decent sense of some other dimensions, but every dimension that we start to look at, we're finding whole stories that are wonderful. A question that I've been particularly frustrated by is where does language and do language analyses fit within my discipline of psychology? I find it much easier to publish in the very top journals of science than in psychology. It's almost as though it's a methodology that doesn't fit in with traditional thinking in psychology because it doesn't fit with the traditional kind of old-timey deductive theoretical approach. I view this work as something that really does cross computer science, computational linguistics, communication. And it's almost, at my university, I almost feel that there needs to be a readjustment of areas. And you're seeing this, I'm guessing, in linguistics with some of your students, that your people are getting the choice, maybe if they're lucky, an academic job, or they go to a social media or other place like that, where they will get paid a lot higher than you're getting paid, or I'm getting paid. And it's not that they're happy there, but they're getting a lot of money. But the point is that this approach is something that is just so interesting and has so much potential to, I think, give us a sense of how cultures are changing and how we're changing. Let me just close out with that, with some more information in terms of if you'd like to get some more information. And let me stop here and open this up for questions.